So, as more time goes on, it feels like, okay, I got it all figured out now. I know who I am in this relationship, or forget that. I know who I am in this body. I know how I show up. I know who I am in this relationship. I got this. Lo and behold, we are constantly learning, right?
Yeah, and specifically communication. So we're constantly learning about why we communicate the way we do, what our triggers are, what our intentions are, and how we can serve communication in a way that actually creates connection rather than disconnect.
Yeah. So we talked in this episode how we can often just move into our default mode, where it's so easy to just react to a situation, to maybe not show up with our best foot forward, but to really just feel justified in our default mode. And so, we're going to tap into helping maybe you understand or illuminate some of your default modes, maybe where the medicine is in communication and connection, relationship. So what else do we talk about?
Yeah, so we talked about the 4 steps that you can utilize in that moment. So you can recognize again where you're sourcing from, where the triggers are coming from, whether you're actually responding from that present moment or from a past moment, and also recognizing how wives are usually right rather than husbands. So that's something we really dive deep into in this episode.
Yeah. And we also talked about sarcasm as a communication tool and how there can be an effective use of sarcasm, right? I wouldn't say that was necessarily one, but maybe there are times to use sarcasm. Just kidding, of course. But the point is that we all want to move towards more freedom in our health, in our physical bodies. But where we often get stuck is really in our relationships, right? So I think if we can utilize these 4 tools, these 4 strategies to optimize our communication, to get out of a cancel culture within a relationship, to just put things on the shelf and not deal with them, we have an opportunity to really free ourselves from the challenges and things that seem to overwhelm us. And so we can have freedom in that.
Yeah. So enjoy, let us know what you think, and happy communicating.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode with Dr. Sonya and myself. We get a chance to chat with one another, and oftentimes when we're doing this podcast together, we often learn from one another. So it's actually an opportunity for communication, connection with each other.
Yeah, and this whole episode is about communication and some of the things that we can tap into to understand each other better, because we're still learning, even though we're in our 12th year of marriage, and still learning and growing together.
Yeah. And sometimes I feel like early in our relationship, I was sort of towing the line. I felt like I had it all figured out.
Yeah, I definitely thought you were my teacher.
I thought I was her teacher, and I was the savior and rescuer and wanting to show her the light of, enlightenment and what all that means. And lo and behold, that's not a role that I stayed in for very long, was it?
I think you still think you are there sometimes, but it's definitely not a role that you anchored into as much as you did before.
Yeah. And a lot of that had to come from an insecurity, not really knowing myself and wanting to play a role and seeing, and also like honestly seeing some of the challenges that you went through. Maybe that was a necessary role that I played at the time for you to feel safe. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely helpful because of the things that I was going through, to have someone support me and help me see things from a different lens, and just to be on my side.
Yeah. And so, we've been together for longer than just 12 years. We've been married for 12 years. And so we've had a long time to get to know each other and learn from one another. And we've made a few mistakes along the way.
Yeah, we still do.
Yeah, exactly. And my role has changed. Your role has changed.
Yeah.
And it's ever evolving, which is cool. And sometimes, when in disagreement, not just with each other, but, I'm sure some of you tuning in as well, sometimes you just want to press the delete button or cancel button.
Or the easy button, like Staples.
Or you're in the middle of an uncomfortable scenario or discussion or disagreement, and you want to press the easy button or escape or how to get out of the situation because the feelings inside are too intense.
Yeah, especially in today's world, because so much happens online and we often don't have a face to who we are communicating with. And it's really easy to say things that maybe you wouldn't say to somebody if you're in person and just walk away from it. But I think it's so important to have these kinds of dialogues to understand that even through that piece of communication, there's an energy exchange, and that still does impact not only yourself, but the other person, but also just your relationship to the world. And I think it's important to recognize that communication happens in so many different levels, and there's so many layers to communication.
Yeah. You know what, in all the challenging conversations that happen on the different social media platforms, there is, to be fair, maybe if those people were sitting in front of each other, maybe they would have a more reasonable conversation. But then maybe some of that's fake. Like maybe it's actually, there's this sort of polarity or this opportunity in these online communications to actually like bring out your shadow, and bring out some of the darkness that's there that you want to say, but you would never say in person. So like, is there like an opportunity for connection in that,
Possibly. I don't know if you remember this commercial, and I can't remember what company created this scenario, but they brought together people with opposing views, like extreme polarities, and they brought them into the room, and they weren't told what their views were, whether it's political views or what they thought about relationships, like same-sex marriages or any of these issues that we kind of speak to. And they just, put them in a room, and they had food together, and they were just speaking to each other like humans, and not realizing that they came from very different backgrounds, different belief systems, and different thought processes. And the moment they found out, some had breakdowns of like, wow, there's this other human that thinks completely different from me, and yet I was able to connect to them on this soul level. And I think that maybe there was one out of all of them that walked away, but really what happened was that they understood that you can sit in the same room with somebody with opposing views and still have a deep, meaningful conversation and just relate to each other as humans. So I think when you're on social media making comments or, having even text conversations, you lose that piece, that humanness of it. So I think, yes, true, you can bring up more of that shadow aspect, but if you do that in person, there's so many different layers to communication. You're seeing how the other person responds. There's more empathy. You're going to maybe choose different words that you can still express your shadow components, but have that compassion for the other person at the same time.
Yeah, that commercial was brilliant. Because they did an individual interview beforehand, so you kind of see where that person was coming from. That some people had gender dialogues that they were for, against, the whole transgender discussion. There was people on like more feminist and then more chauvinist, and so there was these really interesting interviews where it wasn't who they were, but it came out in a dialogue about expressing certain opinions. And then, so those were recorded interviews, and then they go in and have these connection time with the other person where, all of those connection opportunities were actually really great for the most part. And then it was this revealing of these, of the earlier dialogue where they got to see like, wow, that's actually something you said. And then they had to reconcile these differences together. Like it was super awkward and yet beautiful at the same time, because like you said, most of them actually decided to stick around. I think it might've been a beer commercial or something.
I think so.
But they decided to stick around, most of them, and have a beer together, and hug it out and cry. And wow, that was powerful, right? Yeah. So, and I just sort of thought of that in this moment, that maybe social media is allowing us to like go inside and reveal some of that shadow stuff that we're not willing to share when we're face to face. And then you just, mentioned, the challenge in that too, is that we have to do that. I think it's up to us, our responsibility, to also do that with compassion. Yeah. So any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think, just communication again just has so many layers. So whether you're in person, whether you're on text, or whether you're on social media, I think considering all those elements is important, especially from your own lens, because often we're going to receive a message according to the story that we're carrying with us. So that's in relationship with each other, whether it's like husband, wife, partners, or even with our children, with colleagues, with siblings, with anyone that we are in relation with. Often we're coming at that conversation or that disagreement or that discomfort because of our own personal experience of a previous conversation or a trigger that we're stepping into because of that environment at that time. So I think it's so important to understand those layers and understand where the story is coming from when we're making assumptions about somebody else's communication.
Yeah, and we have a tendency to also hold people in the past based on previous reference points for that individual, but also previous experiences when a similar dialogue or context comes into a conversation. We are actually not in the moment, are we? We're literally like remembering being in a defensive state or an attacking state or something, and we're trying to bring that and make sense of the moment that we're in instead of actually sitting with someone going like, wow, we're having a brand new conversation here. What would it be like to be fully present and just sit with the feelings that are coming up in this moment instead of try to make reference to something in the past that may not have anything to do with this moment?
Or we're thinking about what we're going to say already,
right,
without actually tapping into what the other individual is speaking to or what they're feeling or what they're really trying to truly express. We already have something we want to say so that we can prove our point or make ourselves feel heard and understood. And that's often where these conversations these conversations come up because we're just wanting to feel connected, right? So we often get into spaces of disagreement when we're feeling disconnected, and then it just kind of goes into this like cycle of more disconnect because now we're coming from this other intention.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, especially like in a relationship dynamic with couples, so we think we know each other so well that we're just going to try to quickly move through either an uncomfortable conversation or maybe not articulate the full scope of maybe something that an intention that maybe someone has in a relationship. It could be how the day looks like or how someone moved through the morning with acknowledging or not. And, there's all these different preconceptions that are so loaded in each other's personality that are met in a moment. And sometimes we just want to speed through and get to the next thing because we're stuck in our forward thinking mind. And so, example might be getting ready in the morning and not really acknowledging one another. A common argument that Sonya and I have got in the past, I've been more aware of it, is I'll put headphones in the morning and listen to something because I'm always like listening to stuff and learning and whatnot. And I'm totally in the same space as Sonya, but I'm not actually with her and connecting with her. And to me, I'm enjoying myself, but her experience of me is like, well, why are you being an asshole? Like, take those things out and conversate with me, and it's just, had I actually communicate, and this conversation hasn't come up in a while because I don't do that anymore. But had I just communicated, like, listen, Sonya, I love you. I see you. Good morning. There's something I really want to listen to and tune into right now. And if you just give me 5 minutes, I'll be with you and I'll be present with you, but I may be thinking that, and that may be my intention, but the communication of it just never happened, and meanwhile, I can feel justified in how I'm feeling. Like, this is really important to me that I listen to this right now. And, you sort of miss out on an opportunity to connect with someone.
And the perfect mirrors for that really are children, right? They will call us out immediately when they're not feeling our presence because we are distracted. And again, it could be the phone, it could be putting headphones in because you're listening to a podcast. And from your perspective, you're thinking, well, I'm doing something really great that's going to serve them in a different way because I'm working on myself. But what they're seeing is mom's distracted, dad's distracted. They're not paying attention to me and they can't really hear me. Like, our youngest has always been good since he was quite small. If you were holding him on your hip and talking to him and not looking at him, he would take his hand and pull your face so that you were really looking at him eye to eye. And he would say, just see me, look at me when you're talking to me. So I think that we have from a very young age, but it get lost somewhere because we see our environment and how communication happens. And we start to side by side communicate rather than looking at one another to really see the other in our conversation and the response they're actually having.
Yeah, I remember when he used to do that.
Yeah. So let's talk about, you spoke about default and medicine. Like, what does that mean in communication?
Yeah, I think default medicine can show up in different ways. I think it can show up in our lifestyle habits. It can show up, in our behaviors that we do on a regular basis. So our default mode would basically be what is the what is the way that you typically would show up, let's say in a disagreement, or maybe a challenge in life, or in conversation, or just your personality. So my default mode typically has always been a pleaser. I have this, it's insatiable desire for people to like me that I've learned to let go of over time. But that was always a part of my picture. It was always about pleasing others, making sure everyone's happy and okay. And in doing that being the default, that's like the easiest place for me to drop into, whether it's a group of people or a new environment. I'm always trying to like listen and make sure that I'm giving time and space for other people so that they feel comfortable enough, and that so I feel like I'm fitting a role. And so that's my default. Now, interestingly, the more we sit in that default mode, what happens, in a person who presents like that is that you start feeling resentful, right? Because you start playing that old card, well, like, how come they're not asking how I'm doing? Or why aren't they paying attention to me? I'm putting all this effort in, what about me is sort of like the counter to that. And then so with that, internal resistance that comes up, or that resentment that gets played out, the communication turns into passive aggressiveness. And it's like, that becomes a default for me that I recognize. And, it's taken me many years to actually acknowledge and figure it out and realize that I'm doing that. And Sonya sometimes just has to give me a look, like, kind of like this.
They can't see you.
And well, if you're watching the video, you'll have to go back, and maybe I'm sure you'll see her do it to me, maybe even on, different podcasts or what have you. But that sometimes it just takes that look to go like, oh yeah, I'm like sitting in my default mode. Mm-hmm. And so do you want to share your default mode, and then let's get into the medicine?
Yeah, well, before even going into my default mode, like how that can show up for women, I want to just bring some awareness to that damsel archetype that I spoke about in the book, and how that can actually represent itself in our physical body. So when there isn't really a capacity to say no, and we're always saying yes, because that's our way to, like you were saying, to belong or to feel some significance or acceptance into a group, it does show up in resentment. And for women, often there's going to be issues in their ovaries or thyroid, because they're not really using their voice with intention, but instead they're coming from a place of depletion and like that have to mode, like, well, I have to do this, or I should do this in order to feel accepted.
So you're saying I'm damsel?
Maybe there's like a component of damsel, which we all have in different parts of our life. And I think just recognizing when we're playing that role and understanding the gift of the role, the gift of that role is somebody that brings people together, which you do. Like you like to communicate with everyone, you like to connect and all these things. So that is the gift in it, but it can be detrimental when we're using it in a way where we feel like that's the only way we're going to feel accepted, is to be able to say yes. Yeah. And not intentionally saying no when it's not working for you.
Yeah. And it's not that we don't have other personalities that we can sort of default into. Mm-hmm. I just think that there tends to be a dominant one. Yeah. Okay. So what's your default?
Yeah. So mine's the protector. So if some of you have read my story in my book, will know that I kind of built up that wall of protections to make sure that I had control over my environment because of my, big traumas and stories that I've carried. And when I come from that space, that negative mind is definitely more active. So I'm looking for the gaps. I'm looking for where things are not working rather than honoring what is working. So how that shows up in argument, I can go stone cold within a second, and I can live there for days and not move. I can be so steady in that and literally just stare at him.
It's scary as hell.
For an hour, if it's necessary.
Inside, I get terrified.
Yeah, like I don't need to speak about it. I don't need to do any of those things. I go into that almost that silent warrior mode to build my wall even further, so that there's no vulnerability there. Somebody can't come in and attack. And that's kind of where I step into. And then, of course, what that's going to create in my body is just resistance and the lack of, we talk about inability to be soft in those moments and really be my truest self, because that's not who I actually am. It's just a mask that I've had to put on in order to survive. And so at some point it did serve me. So before we get into that piece, you want to talk about the medicine?
Yeah, but what I want to say is like how I receive that. It's like the perfect medicine for my default.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you know, we'll talk about my medicine for a little bit, but I think that it's the perfect mirror for me to recognize like the need within me is to make sure that you're happy and you're okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so that there's this level of like responsibility that my persona, my personality wants to own in order to help you see me in a better light.
Mm-hmm.
Because like my world would collapse or crumble if I somehow was shone in a not so bright light where I look like the bad guy,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's my default. And so it's a great mirror for me to like own the medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So my medicine would be assertiveness, speaking what it is that I want, or my intention. And again, that's my word for the year, is to be more intentional. And then part of that is just articulating where I'm at, what I'm feeling, how I can show up for the other person, how I can show up for myself. And so I think it's assertiveness and being clear, being clear is to be kind, those kind of things. And I haven't perfected this by any means, but it's the exact opposite of being the people pleaser, right? And it's creating, boundaries around like, what I can control within my own psychology, emotional body, and what's not mine to fix or control in hers,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's a work in progress, but that would be my medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my medicine would be to be more vulnerable in that space. Like I feel like I can really step into that when I'm feeling safe with myself. But for me, the medicine really would be to tap into that feeling at that time where I don't need the external environment to change, but I just feel that safety within me to be able to bring the wall down so that there can be a bit more softness. Because as Nick reminds me, my tongue can be very sharp
Yeah.
when it needs to be.
My goodness. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is it your true name, or is it the sword of truth or something?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah.
So do you want to say anything about that, or?
Yeah, I mean, as Indo-Canadians or Indians, we get our Indian name, and my true name is Sandeep, which is actually the light of God, so the light of truth. So it kind of pierces through all of everything else and just shines a light on truth. But when speaking the truth, sometimes it can feel a bit sharp for the other individual, especially if I'm coming from a place of protection. But if I'm coming from a place of softness, I can still speak that truth, but it'll just have a different edge.
Yeah, and sometimes it doesn't. Like sometimes it still comes sharp, but with love.
Mm-hmm.
It's different. Like you are very direct in how you communicate, which is brilliant for my own learning process as well. And it's really a gift and opportunity for me to really own the medicine, and recognize, when I go into my default mode. So that's significant. So is there other like personality types that are quite common? I mean, I think those are pretty common ones, but any other ones that kind of come to mind? Obviously there's lots out there, but what are some other big ones you see maybe in practice or working with women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I always go back to that triangle of disconnect for my way of understanding it. So the Duchess, the damsel, and the diva. So the Duchess is one of control. So she has to control her environment and may not even have time to argue, right? There's not going to be any time. So may say the things that need to be said in order to move on to the next thing. So there really isn't time to kind of sit in what's happening. And we spoke about the damsel, and for the diva, it's everything's about perfection. So if there is an argument, again, she's going to probably step into more of that damsel state and do more of that pleasing so that the boat's not getting rocked. And so I think when we're playing out any of these roles, we really have to ask ourselves, so like the 4 things that we have for you guys today of like how we can assess our communication is like, how is that serving you, or how has it served you in the past? And just like honoring the fact that you needed to create that mode of communication to help you navigate your life to up until today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before we get into those 4 things, I really, because you're so good at like walking through the mud of life, to really appreciating the shadow and the fact that not everything's roses and rainbows. How do you help people appreciate that, or just like really step into that a little bit more? Because I think that in the world that we're in, we're all feeling it. None of us really want to feel it. But do you have any, tips or strategies to like be okay with the fact that everything's not okay? And I know we've talked about this a little bit before, everything's not awesome.
Yeah. Like the movie.
but I think it's important in recognizing your default mode, like where you just trying to play the role, to pacify your own emotions or others, and where's an opportunity for medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the shadow can actually give lots of gifts of medicine because it gives us an idea of our other polarity, and also this recognition of that, like, everything is temporary. So we don't have to live in it, but we can honor it and recognize it, because that too is a part of us. So we can't have light without the dark. So it's really just honoring that yin and the yang within, instead of just trying to always go towards the light and ignoring those shadow pieces. And those shadow pieces come up in different ways. Maybe there's moments of envy and jealousy in ourselves. Maybe there's moments of regret. Maybe there's moments of guilt and shame. There's moments of all these things, but instead of trying to ignore what's happening and honoring it, is so important, because that's what's going to help us understand ourselves even more. So if there is a moment of envy, maybe the envy is just kind of showing us that, hey, there's something in our life that isn't working. In order for us to get to where that individual is, maybe we need to make some changes. So if the more we learn from those shadow aspects of ourselves, I think the more deeply anchored we can get into the light.
Yeah. And I think where we get stuck is when we're comparing.
Yes.
So when we're comparing like our own behavior, or when we're looking at people that we admire, and it looks like everything's all put together on the surface, like we keep seeing where we're not, and then judging ourselves and blame, and then that's just another pattern we get into, and we're not really aware that we're stuck inside of our shadow there either. And so, I say sort of invite the discord into your life to some degree, not invite it, like call it on and be overly provoking, unless you feel like that's the mood you're in that day, go for it. But the point is I think that when we're in that, we said this at the beginning, there's no easy button or cancel button to just remove ourselves like there is on social media. So what if we could articulate a little bit more specifically what we're feeling? And so these are some of the 4 steps that we're in. But I would say, if we're in disagreement with somebody, could we ask ourselves, is there an opportunity to connect? Or what is this relationship that I have with this person? And is there reason to, deepen friendship, connection, and what have you? Like, I think there's a lot of little questions that we can ask when we're, facing disagreement and challenge in our lives.
And just looking at it again from that shadow aspect, if we look at life itself, winter represents darkness and shadow, but spring follows winter. So that's where the growth begins to happen. That's where there's a rebirth. And we wouldn't have that rebirth if we didn't move into that shadow. When a child's being born, the mother goes into a phase of transition where everything feels chaotic and crazy. She's shaking and it feels like there's no end to that moment. And yet it's so temporary. And now all of a sudden there's a birth. And even before birth, that child is in the womb where it's complete darkness. But in order for her or him to get into the light, they have to pass through that darkness and that shadow. So just like honoring the fact that this is just a part of us and a part of who we are can help us get into these like 4 steps that we're going to talk about, so that there's more ease in communication.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because that's really like the seasons of life, right? And even when we're talking about, our fasting program or different things, like stuff is going to come up. You're going to be in the middle of a challenge. How do you sit with that and not live there for eternity, and recognize that there's a change in season coming? Okay. So we've got 4 strategies for you. So do you want to walk us through the first one?
Yeah. So the first one really is that piece where we just spoke to, is understanding where this style of communication or this default really served you in the past. When it was it that you had to step into that mode so that you can protect yourself, or maybe feel heard and seen, and all the various things that you needed for you to feel safe in that moment, just recognizing where it's coming from and how it served you.
So do you want to give some examples, like of our own lives?
Well, we kind of did with our default mechanism.
No. So like if I was to be in, if I was to be in my people pleaser mode, I could literally go back to like elementary school and really, I played the role of a bully for a bit, but then I recognized that I was, I had some self-awareness at the time, and then actually shifted a whole friend group to actually hang out with the kids who were sort of the trouble kids, right? And that gave me sort of an opportunity to see things through sort of 2 different sets of eyes. But inherently the need to belong was always there, right? So if I had to go back, in a moment, it would be, that desire to belong. So seeing where that's coming from.
Yeah. So then that mode of communication served you so that you could fit in
Yeah.
at that time
Yeah.
and help you survive, because that's the primary goal of the brain, right? And our bodies is to help us survive, and the mind will do whatever it needs to do in order for that to happen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so and Sonya obviously gets into her story in the book. So
mm-hmm. Yeah. So the second one is, what is your intention and what is your motivation in that conversation, and what do you want to receive from this communication? So what is the outcome? So often we can go into a space of an argument just wanting to maybe feel heard, or we go into that space like wanting more connection, or we go into that space of like really wanting to feel understood by the other individual. Like, what is the outcome that you want? Do you want more connection, or is this a stepping stone towards releasing that relationship? So really knowing your intention can help support how you speak, and if you're whether you're going into your default or you're really understanding what mode of communication you need in that moment.
Cool. So what would be an example there?
Go ahead.
No, I gave an example for the first one, so now it's your turn.
Yeah, just like what I said, if your intention
pay attention.
If your motivation is for more connection,
right,
then you may come with your medicine rather than your default.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So an intention, maybe that opportunity for, wanting to feel like you're belonging, what have you. But I think many times, when it comes to communication, there's a default of wanting to be right. Right?
Yeah, he's lifting his hand.
I'm lifting my hand. If you're watching the audio, there's an inherent desire to want to be right, because if you're right, you're the golden boy or the golden girl.
Yeah.
Right. And so, recognizing that intention of like, why is that there? Mm-hmm. Right. And so you can actually take that intentional question and take that back to number one. And so in recognizing that for myself, I can own that, often I want to be right. And then recognize, well, who's that actually serving? Like, there's no like scoreboard up on the wall, and there's no reward for being right. There really isn't, even in a conversation that may happen on social media. Like, do you feel victorious by, putting someone down, or, having a counter point of view, or, is there the bigger intention in that moment, an opportunity to truly connect? Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to give some examples.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then, so number 3 is really recognizing your triggers. So that trigger could be just in that environment at that time. Maybe it's a smell. Maybe the trigger is just the tone in which the other individual is using that reminds you of a tone that maybe a parent used, or a previous relationship, or some sort of memory that shows up because of that trigger, and understanding that now, am I responding because of that past experience that you were talking about, how we're sourcing from there, or am I sourcing from what's happening right now in this moment?
Yeah. So this is a question of really, am I being present mm-hmm. time conscious? And Sonya had an issue with a beard that I decided to grow a couple of years ago that was a strong trigger for her. And every time that she would make, maybe in my defense, not as assertive comments, maybe it's more offhand comments like, well, your beard's kind of uncomfortable. Like, kissing you was way more enjoyable when you didn't have the beard. Wow, well, it's not TMI, you're my wife. So of course, there's smooching that goes on in our household. But, maybe, I don't know, but maybe had we had a proper sit down conversation, and if I really, chose to be listening to you in that time of the beard, this is called the time of the beard, which, how long did it last for?
Too long.
It doesn't really matter. It was just too long. But in my defense, because we had a big blow up at the end of that beard fiasco, right? Mm-hmm. It was, I wasn't really listening to her and her needs. Maybe she wasn't being assertive enough. So I'm speaking for her, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, in our communication. And I didn't realize, or maybe I didn't want to realize the depth of her pain in what she was experiencing based on the trigger that she had. And so that was a really, really interesting time. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even as we're speaking, sometimes I think when we, like you said, when we don't want to hear something.
Mm-hmm. I said a few things there.
Yeah.
that sort of baited this
Because I
conversation?
really did communicate directly with that sword voice that your beard is very triggering for me. Please shave it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I clearly was not listening to my wife, this amazing woman next to me, and I was coming up with all sorts of different reasons why it was so important.
It's very important for her spirituality at that moment.
Yeah, I was
And
very
I
much.
totally just used sarcasm to get my point across right there.
But I was very much in an identity of how I was supposed to show up in the world based on my masculine beard, my mane, my lion's mane. Anyway, so that was number 3. So you can, we're
you
probably
can read more about this in Woman Unleashed.
Yeah, there you go. And we could probably pick that apart more, but I think and hope for couples listening, or if you're in a relationship, hopefully you can sort of have a reflection on maybe a recurring theme that showed up, and really,
like when your wife is right, but then you forget.
Yeah. And I promise you, those listening, that there are times when I'm right in this relationship. We just tend to talk about the times that she's right more often than those ones.
Okay. I'll let that one go.
Okay. And we're going to do a review at the end of this. So let's move into number 4.
Yeah. So number 4 is pausing, right? The pause moment, and then being able to reframe. So that pause is that permission to recognize what's actually happening. Like you were saying, that present moment time, just like being right here, right now, and recognizing that is this reaction that's building up in my body with my emotions. Like, what meaning am I putting towards that emotion? Where am I sourcing from when I'm about to respond? Can help to reframe how we then communicate.
Yeah, like it feels a little bit like number 3, in that number 3 is sort of bringing present time consciousness, or like, or even just questioning, where are we accessing this information? Are we actually present with this person? But this one feels a little bit more like an actual action step, in that breathe, like take a breath, wait a second, maybe even go back to step 1, 2, 3. Take a look at those 3 pieces, so you get a little more clarity in that pause moment,
or just even saying that I'm feeling really triggered right now, so I need a few minutes to collect myself.
Yeah, because it's very common in conversation to already obviously know what the other person's thinking, or what they're going to say, because again, we're just referencing everything from the past, right? I'm using sarcasm to teach here, and maybe it's not very effective, but maybe it is. But the whole point is that, yes, what if we came into, a conversation, we're feeling all of this really uncomfortable stuff, and said, you know what, my love, I'm feeling that, or when you said that to me, when this thing came up, what I was feeling inside was that I was feeling unheard or disrespected. I was feeling all of these things. I recognize that you can't make me feel this way, but this is something that actually got stirred up within me. I want you to know that got stirred up within me. And I just want to feel validated that you have heard where that pain is sitting inside my body. And I don't need you to do anything about that, other than to just hear and understand, or maybe not even understand, but comprehend that what I'm speaking to you is a pain for me. And I just really needed to get that off my chest. Thank you so much for listening. I don't know if there's anything for us to do. Maybe we could hug it out and have a little smooch or something, just so that validation of being heard. And if I could go back, I know in our relationship, that wouldn't be enough, because I wasn't really entertaining step 1, 2, 3, right? Because often we sit so deeply in our pain body, we sit so deeply in our personality, in our default mode, that we're just saying that to try to sound like we know what we're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that, like, can we show up in number 4 authentically, and actually speak from that space of, I'm actually just trying to get this off my chest, and there's nothing, like, if we can come to that in a clean way, there's no expectation of the other person other than the other person just to hold space.
Yeah.
And then it can be, okay, great. I'm so glad I got that off my chest. I feel so much better. That person literally didn't have to do anything other than just hold space. Like, that's the beauty of it. It's
really important. When you're being really authentic, there's no expectation of the other person to do anything to make you feel better, to even validate, really. I mean, they could say, yes, like, I hear you, but really, just if you're coming into that space authentically, there is zero expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's really like, it's an opportunity for you to clear this stuff that's just, we just carry around this goo. It's like heavy and sticky, and it's uncomfortable to feel all these things, right? But it's really an opportunity to clear it out. And that other person, should they love you as much as you want them to, which they, when you're in a relationship, that's the expectation, is that each other show up and are really reinforced by the commitment that we're making on a daily basis to one another. And as a result of that, that's an anchor point, right? It's an anchor point to know that this woman beside me has got my back no matter what. If I'm acting like a goofball, she's going to let me know. And then it's up to me to actually present her with the feelings that I'm feeling in that moment. And maybe it takes a few days, like maybe you're not going to figure it out right away. Of course, we'll have to have our own learning process. But
yeah, we did a relationship course a little while back with Peter Crone. There was something that he said in there that both of us really not related to, but kind of took to heart. It's like seeing the other person new.
Yes.
All the time.
Fresh set of eyes.
Yeah, with a fresh set of eyes. And that, I think, can really summarize all of these 4 points. If we're seeing each other with that fresh set of eyes, we're not sourcing from the past, we're not sourcing from the triggers, we're not sourcing from the expectations or the judgments, we're just sourcing from what's happening right there in that moment.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So let's review those 4 steps.
Yeah. So number 1.
So let's anchor people into an experience. Okay. Someone didn't put their, I'm gonna bring up stuff that we talk about sometimes. I noticed that when I'm playing Sonya, just by the way, I noticed that it's often the case when you and the boys come in the house, you just leave your shoes at the front door, and like they're just kind of sitting there, and I'm done putting them away in the closet.
Yeah.
You can be me.
Okay. Yeah, I'll put them away later.
Yes. Okay. And then, if I'm believing of this joker, then I'll say, okay, great. Well, maybe I can watch you put them away, and we can have this little experience of closure. And then you can repeat that behavior on subsequent entries into the house. And so I
don't think this is a good example of what we're trying to do. I think you're confusing everyone. That was a good try.
Okay,
we're just going to summarize.
It started off well.
It did. Yeah, it was a good try.
So that was a good example.
So we're just going to summarize the 4, and you are going to put your own examples in so that it starts to serve you and your communication and your relations.
Thank you for stopping me.
Yeah. Number 1.
Grasping.
Yeah. Number 1 is to really understand where your default mechanism, so identifying it first, and where that default has served you in your life, and thanking that default so that you can step into more of that present moment.
And is there an opportunity for your medicine to come forward?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then number 2 is understanding your intention and motivation for that communication. Like, what is it that you want? And what is it that you want to understand more about yourself and maybe the person that you're conversating with? And then number 3 is recognizing the triggers, recognizing and knowing that a lot of your responses and reactions may be coming from triggers. So how can we now do number 4 and pause so that we can self-reflect, so we can reframe?
Yeah. And reframe with, in this situation, this feeling stirred within me, and I just want to share with you how I'm feeling about that in this moment.
Yeah, great. So let us know how that goes for all of you. If you utilize those 4 steps, or if you had any awarenesses and insights, please share with us. Maybe put it on Instagram, Facebook, tag us so that we can kind of learn from you guys too, and each other.
Yeah. And to your point, if you like this video, again, please comment, share, and we'd love to hear from you. So thanks so much for tuning in. And as we learn from one another and from all of you, I'm sure this world can all use this medicine as a way to move forward in a really healthy, loving, compassionate kind of way.